Morning. As you find your seats, I want to introduce myself. My name is Lisa Dagger, and I serve on the Adult Education Committee, and I'm glad to be with you here today. Thank you all for coming for this first of 3 conversations about comparing the Gospels with Reverend Helms. I invite you to pray with me as we get started. Gracious and loving God, we thank you for this beautiful day and this first Sunday in Lent and for our time together. We thank you for Reverend Helms as he leads us this morning. We gather in this place drawn together by a hunger for wisdom, truth, and understanding. As we study your word to us in the Gospels, may we see with fresh eyes the depth and breadth of Jesus' life and teachings. Help us to embrace the richness of each writer's perspective, that we might be shaped into more compassionate, courageous, and faithful disciples. In this world that feels so fractured and fearful and divided, let this time of study and conversation be a source of hope and renewal. May our learning lead us to knowledge and action, building bridges, seeking justice, and embodying the love of Christ in all that we do. Bless our teacher, our conversation, and our hearts as we seek your truth. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Really appreciate that. And good morning to everyone. It is great to have you all here today. So with the possible exception of the book of Jonah, comparing the Gospels is one of my absolute favorite things to talk about with the biblical text. I'm thrilled to be doing with you all, and very grateful for this time. This was my absolute favorite class in seminary, so much so that I signed up to TA for it 2 more semesters after it. So this is truly a passion for me. And it feels particularly fitting as we begin at the outset of the season of Lent, a time in which we spend as much as any in our church year, time going deep into the Gospels and the beauty that is contained within. So I'm really grateful for that and grateful for this opportunity to explore them. So you'll see on the first slide, and if you do have your handouts, you'll see close-up pictures of this as well. This is actually from the Fourth Church pulpit right here. You can see over here on the left. What you may not know is that surrounding that pulpit are these images you'll see of an angel, a winged lion, a winged ox, and an eagle, all of which represent one of the gospel writers. And so if you ever, next time you're in the sanctuary, I invite you to go up and take a look. You even have Peter hiding around the corner. Somehow he got the back spot on the pulpit. But this is one of the innumerable amazing little architectural details that you'll find in the sanctuary. And actually, on Ash Wednesday, as we were imposing ash out, I looked up and saw those very things on the archway over the church. It's really, really amazing. You might be saying to yourself, how did these come to represent the various gospel writers? An angel for Matthew, this winged lion for Luke, for Mark, a winged ox for Luke, and then an eagle for John. And if you see on your handouts, there are 2 passages, one from Ezekiel and one from Revelation, in which, as these writers have a vision of God, they see these 4 beings sort of surrounding the throne. And in the medieval church, these came to be seen as representations of, these are our windows into better seeing who Christ is. And so you'll see this pop up, whether it's in medieval paintings or in other little architectural details. It's an amazing thing. So this is just a fun little aside before we get into the class, but just wanted to share. It's amazing where you see these things pop up. Now, before we get into any comparison, it is important to do a little work to define what gospel is. And as you can see, the word comes from an Old English word, godspel, which translates to good news. There is an evangelistic quality to these. Now, you'll find scholars, and there's a little bit of dispute, talking about how these gospels in some ways mirror Greco-Roman biographies in the way that they're laid out and set up. But others, and I think I'm convinced by this as well, that they are to some degree totally unique in the ancient world, particularly when you take into account this evangelistic perspective. I've always really appreciated at the very near the tail end of the Gospel of John. So this is from the 20th chapter. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. There you have the gospel writer laying out his purpose for writing this, that there is not just an account of who Jesus was in his earthly ministry, but it is meant to evangelize. It is meant to be filling our faith in the here and now. And one of the beautiful things, and I think why it is so important when we look at this as an image, I really see the Gospels and each of them as sort of helping us see different facets of who Jesus is, what he meant to these communities, and what he means for us today. And so for me, this image of the pulpit and almost thinking of it as different perspectives on who Jesus is, all united together into one, is at the very root of what it is to do comparative gospels work. You'll sometimes have people, and I would describe bad faith, comparing them, looking for differences and sort of trying to find whether they would define them as errors or whatnot. To me, this image is what is at the heart of what we're going to be doing over this class series. It is looking at all of the different facets of who the gospel writers saw, who Jesus was, what his ministry meant, what it meant to their communities, and for us, what it means to us today. And so that to me is a really exciting and beautiful thing. Now, one of the other curiosities, and we're going to get a little bit more into the dating as we get a little further into this class, is people are often confused about why they weren't written shortly after Jesus' death. Scholars believe that they weren't written down until decades later, and that's always been a point of confusion. There's debate. Likely Jesus would have been crucified in 30 AD, but there's a chance 33 based off of very complicated calendaring that we do not need to get into now. But one of the things that I think is important to remember about why we don't have these gospels sort of coming into being until decades later is that this was predominantly an oral culture. And oral storytelling and passing along was the norm, particularly in the early church when many of those earliest Christians weren't from upper classes. These were folks for whom, whether they were workers or servants or whatever it might have been, being able to recount orally and hearing from eyewitnesses, those evangelists, were predominantly how the gospel spread. Now, I think it's curious, there's no way of knowing this for certain, but in the 60s, I'm talking about 60s AD, not the 1960s, in the 60s, you have the martyrdom of Paul, Peter, James, the brother of Jesus, these pillars of the early church, all pass away. And I think there's no coincidence that you start to see some of the gospels taking shape in that time frame. This sort of first generation of eyewitnesses, and in Paul's case, a little different than an eyewitness, but as they began to pass away, there was this need to record and write down and to continue passing on to next generations. Now there are some, and we can talk about this in a second, who believe that there may have been precursors to the gospels that we have today. Likely, our gospel writers did not sit down, wake up one morning, and just compose these start to finish. Almost certainly there are sources behind them. Luke even intimates that at the start of his gospel. And so what kind of precursor texts were there to the ones that we have today is a fascinating question that maybe we'll have a wonderful archaeological discovery sometime. In the meantime, all we can do is speculate. But for the next good bit of time, we're going to be spending a little bit of time on this last question about why are Mark, Matthew, and Luke's gospels so similar to one another and yet so distinct at the same time. And so if you look at your handouts, and we'll look at the very bottom here, we're going to start doing a little work. I'll let this aside for later. We are going to start doing a little of what is called Gospels parallel work with the synoptic Gospels. And so synoptic is referring to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If you asked, let's say, 3 people in this room to, let's say, write down an account of what the pulpits and what all those different images mean, if you had 3 people in here write them down, I bet all of us would write a similar but slightly different, unique take on that account. Same for any event. And so when you look at this, you'll recognize that there are so many similarities between these texts, so much so that scholars and pretty much anyone who reads these assume that they have to be based off of one another because of how many similarities we have. And having passed on, and having passed on. He saw, Jesus saw. When you go line by line through these texts, you begin to see that it's almost positive that this is not by chance that they could be so similar, that likely one or both of the Gospels were using another as a source. And that's a fascinating thing that gets us into something that has been described as scholars as the synoptic problem. Now, problem not as in it's a problem that this exists. It's a problem because it's an incredibly confusing question that scholars have been arguing about for decades, and it's not getting better, it's getting worse. And so we're going to get into that in a second. But one of the really important things and why this work is so foundational, if you're ever curious, I have some recommendations at the end. There are amazing things. This gospel parallels got me through seminary. Love this thing. You can see side-by-side accounts of every single one of the matching passages between the Gospels, and you can compare them. Now, not only are those similarities important, it's also the little differences. And when you start taking those little differences on the whole and on the sum, you begin to see a little bit about what each gospel writer might be doing. Now, for example, this one is less about what's going on and more just a unique little quirk. You have this difference of name that goes on with these. You have Matthew writing about Matthew, but you'll notice Levi, son of Alphaeus, a tax collector named Levi in Mark and Luke's account. If they are based on one another, what accounts for that disparity? And why is Matthew the one to identify as Matthew? Is he correcting something from Mark or Luke or something like that? Interesting question, and ones that scholars have been wrestling with. Is Levi Matthew, or is Matthew just correcting something? It's fascinating. Another really fun one, you have this very similar phrase, he said to him, follow me. You see that match in all three of the gospel texts. And yet Luke adds on a little extra something. And having left everything, not just having arisen, having left everything, he followed him. Now, that might just be a small addition that Luke was making. And yet, part of the beauty of this work is when you see and read these passages in Luke, Luke is consistently adding phrases like this. Is this a message about Luke's discipleship? That part of discipleship in Luke's mind is leaving everything. And you see over and over, Luke have this interest in material poverty, this understanding of being part of community, and you certainly get that in Acts as well. And so in these little ways, it's very rarely spelled out, but as you go through and compare these texts, you begin to see these little hints of how the gospel writers are sort of shaping and helping us understand what is important to them and to their community. And I think that's amazing and beautiful. Now, the synoptics, it comes from this Greek word synopsis, the seeing all together. And so it is in sort of the sum total of seeing what the gospel writers chose to include, potentially to change from one another's gospels, or in some cases to omit. Taken as a whole, that helps get us a sense of what was important to them as they communicated to their communities who Jesus was. But the complicating question in all this, and that synoptic problem I was mentioning, is that in order to fully understand who was changing what, you need to know who was written first. And that has been one of the great points of debate that has been going on for decades now. So as you'll see on this chart, and you have, if you flip to the second page in your handout, if you want to look at it a little bit closer, there is a surprising amount that is shared between the Gospels. You see Mark, over 3/4 of Mark can be found in both Matthew and Luke. Fascinating. You have some other passages that are potentially shared by Mark and Matthew, shared by Mark and Luke. Ultimately, and this is fascinating too, there's only 3% of the Gospel of Mark that can't be found in one of the other Gospels. So an interesting point that we will come back to. You also have, beyond this triple tradition, something that has been puzzling scholars for centuries. Matthew and Luke seem to have a great deal of overlap in what's called double tradition that they have in common that Mark does not. How did that come to be? There's been some speculation, and we're going to get into those speculations in a second, but that's one that's puzzled scholars for centuries. They primarily are sayings of Jesus, which has been one of the main hints, but that's been a source of confusion. We also see, for example, with Luke, over a third of the Gospel of Luke is completely unique. Luke is noted, and we'll get into it on a few weeks when we cover Luke in detail. Luke is noted for some of the best known parables in the Bible, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son. If you ask your average person on the street, they may assume that those would appear in all the Gospels. They only appear in Luke. And Luke seems to have had this amazing and rich collection of parables that the other Gospel writers may not have been aware of. You also have a similar thing going on with Matthew with a whole host of other traditions. So I don't mean to get too number crunchy on this, but I think this is a good representation of one of the fascinations for scholars, that there's so much that they have in common, and yet they're each trying to do very unique things as well. And it's really, really fascinating. So I should couch this. I looked up one of my favorite writers on this topic. His book, Mark Goodacre, called The Synoptic Problem, begins his book with this. I don't think this is a good way to sell your book, but that's neither here nor there. For many New Testament scholars, studying the synoptic problem is something to avoid at all costs. Those who do study it are warned not to allow themselves to be dragged into a quagmire from which they may never emerge. Welcome to the synoptic problem. Why this has been so thorny and tricky over the years, and you can see in your handout some of the proposed solutions to this, is that you can credibly posit a whole lot of different relationships between how these Gospels came to have so much in common with one another. One of the most ancient ones, what is attributed to Augustine of being the first one to sort of vocalize this, saw Matthew as being the first Gospel to be written, that Mark based his writings off of Matthew, and that Luke used both Matthew and Mark as a source. For Augustine, this explained both the triple tradition, that they're all are shared, but also that there is the sharing of Matthew and Luke. But there are problems to this. If that is the case, why is Mark so much shorter than Matthew? If Mark is basing his work off of Matthew, why does he spend so much time cutting things out of it rather than adding on? You would think it would be the reverse. There are other hypotheses. Many look similar. It's just sort of a flip of this Augustine hypothesis. This one where Mark was written first, followed by Matthew, and that those, I need to be careful with this mic, sorry, shared into creating Luke's gospel. But there's a similar and related hypothesis. This one has probably been the dominant theme in 20th century scholarship, that's called the two-source hypothesis. That Matthew and Luke, yes, they use Mark's gospel as part of the basis. But there also is this hypothesized work, comes from a German word, quelle, which means saying, that they call the Q document, that would be a collection of sayings of Jesus. I think you may have heard me say before, a lot of what's shared between Matthew and Luke are sayings of Jesus rather than narrative or stories. And so the hypothesis from scholars was that perhaps there was this common collection of sayings that Matthew and Luke knew about that Mark was otherwise unaware. It's a possibility. But you also have others who have proposed things like, perhaps there is a gospel behind all of these. We know that they were written in Greek, but that wasn't the language of Christ and his disciples. Was there a, sometimes called the Aramaic proto-gospel, a gospel written in Aramaic that is now lost to time, that explains the relationship between all of these? There are so many different hypotheses out there. I only included some of the best known. When I looked it up, I think we're up to like 15 or so different hypotheses that people have put out there. So much so, I actually just picked this book up, just came out in January of this year, another hypothesis into the mix, which is great. And it was a very good read. James Barker is a current scholar. He describes it as sort of a snowball hypothesis in which Mark used Matthew, used Luke, or I'm sorry, I'm doing that poorly. Mark was used by Matthew, Matthew was used by Luke, Luke was used by John. Now you notice I haven't mentioned John yet, and that gets into a whole complicated case. Part of why I'm bringing this up is to say it is clear that there is a relationship between these gospels. Comparing them and using those little contrasts is vital to understanding what they're about and what each author was trying to do. But this synoptic problem has been beguiling for decades. And I don't know about you, but I personally find it fascinating and fun. So if you ever want to go deeper into all of this, I would be glad to do so at some point. But I do want to get us out of the theoretical and get a little bit more into what we can know and posit about these gospel writers. At this point, leaving aside that synoptic problem, most scholars, if you ask them, would say they believe that Mark was the first gospel written, primarily for the reasons that I was sharing, that if this is the shortest, if the vast majority of what's contained in it is reflected in other gospels, it seems safe to say that Mark was not just a really ruthless editor, that this was the basis and that subsequent gospels were adding on to that. And you see in some ways, I had mentioned Luke as sort of this hint of this, at the very outset of the gospel, writing to potentially a patron, potentially Theophilus, that name you see at the end means God lover in Greek, so potentially just any Christian. Luke says, since many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, as one having a grasp of everything from the start, to write a well-ordered account for you, most excellent Theophilus. So you can see what Luke is saying, that he is very aware of others who have done this sort of work, but feels compelled for his community, potentially for this individual, to essentially assemble these in something that will be compelling to whether it's his community or to this patron. And I think that this is one of the few hints we have from the biblical text about why we have these four distinct gospels, is that they were really speaking to individual communities and about who Jesus was to that community. And I think that that is a really fascinating. I wish we had more of an intro, but it's a good start in any case. In terms of what we know about the gospel writers, and this is one of the great challenges, is that as far as anyone knows, the gospels did not have titles on the front that we would have when we open up the text today. It doesn't say the Gospel of Matthew on the earliest accounts. But potentially the early church just knew who wrote it and didn't need those titles. But these titles don't start appearing until over a century later and being applied to the text. And so it makes it incredibly complicating to know who exactly were these gospel writers. As you can see down here from this bullet point, the earliest sort of attestation about Matthew and Mark specifically comes from a bishop from a community who was likely writing around the year 100, which is wonderful and is very early, and so that's very compelling evidence. The problem is that we don't have that. We have a quote of a quote. We're going several steps removed, almost like historical telephone. This bishop is being quoted by Irenaeus, who is subsequently being quoted by Eusebius, who is one of the great church historians. But part of what is challenging about his history is you see it's almost 300 years after Jesus' time. Eusebius is one of the few to write this really expansive account of the early church and gets incredibly into details, almost certainly had source texts that we do not have today. And yet, it's hard because we don't have any surviving writings. Papias, we don't have those source texts. We have Eusebius quoting, or in some cases, bending quotes in order to fit the wider history that he's writing. And so that is one of the great complicating factors as well. But we're going to take a little bit of time. I will couch all of this in saying we may never fully know who Mark was, who Matthew was. But I'm going to share from church tradition and from what scholars have been able to posit. What can we know about them? Starting with Mark, assuming that Mark was indeed the first written. So the gospel writer, Mark, one of the initial problems right out of the gate is that Mark was an unbelievably common name within the Roman Empire. Mark or Marcus, you see records pop up everywhere with those names. And so when you see, for example, in Paul's writings, You have a Mark referred to in Paul's writings. Is that Mark the gospel writer? Perhaps. And that's a frustrating perhaps. But you have, from this quote of Papias that I had mentioned, he seems to suggest that John Mark, and yes, that is a dual name, and there were many dual names as well, like Simon Peter or John Mark or others in the early church, seems to suggest that John Mark is the gospel writer Mark, that those are one and the same. But then a century later, you have another bishop, Hippolytus, who very clearly delineates them as different people, that there's a gospel writer Mark, that there's John Mark, and then there's another, Paul's companion Barnabas has a cousin named Mark, that those three are distinct and separate people. Are they the same person? Are they not? The historical record on this is really blurry. But like I said, you have Eusebius, who is one of the best windows into the early church while also working with that complication of writing so long after the fact. According to Eusebius, what Mark was doing was writing down the sermons of Peter while he was traveling with him in one of the early missionary journeys. Now, who is to say whether or not that is true? It very well may be. One of the other things, and we'll get into a little more timing around the gospel, is that certainly there were pieces of Jesus' ministry that were being written down and composed. I mentioned that this was an oral storytelling culture primarily, but Paul wouldn't have been writing letters to church communities if there weren't some who were able to read and write and translate. Surely there were other things being written down that eventually made their way into the gospel. Perhaps not all of it, but perhaps there is a good solid core of the Gospel of Mark that did come from sermons of Peter. It's hard to parse out, we'll never know, but it is intriguing. But you also have these other, interesting little hints there. Clement of Alexandria in Egypt, which is funny because it conflicts with this next one. Clement of Alexandria in the year 200 describes Mark as being written by Rome. Unfortunately for us, that's all he says in the sentence. No proof, no anything. He just states it as a fact. Is it true? Potentially. We know that if this was the same, this John Mark was traveling potentially with Paul and ended up in Rome towards the end of Paul's time, potentially. But one of the other points of conflict is that John Mark is consistently described as traveling with Paul, and yet Eusebius is talking about him writing down the sermons of Peter. Were they traveling together? It's unknown. And then you also have one of the great preachers in the early church, John Chrysostom, also in the same way that Clement is so matter of fact about Rome, states unequivocally that Mark was written in Egypt. Where he got that, we'll never know. So you have all these interesting little hints that in some cases likely do contain a grain of truth. But it's hard to ascertain exactly where this gospel would have been written. And again, this complicated historical record around, is Mark the gospel writer, John Mark the traveling companion of Paul, and Mark the cousin of Barnabas, are they all the same person? Are they distinct? I'm just going to hold this if that's okay with you all. Or maybe Fred, can we get a different mic maybe? Sorry, I'm having a hard time with this one. Lots of clicking and popping. So this is kind of the fun as you dig into some of the history around this. It's really genuinely fascinating. All right, so that is what little we know about Mark as a person. Now, the question of when Mark was written, you had just heard that there is potentially these little threads that may come from the 40s of sermons from Peter. But interestingly, there's a section of Mark that scholars have pretty much decided. All right, I'm going to quickly switch my mic. Thank you, Fred. Appreciate that. So there's a section from the Gospel of Mark, the 13th chapter, that seems to very clearly match up with a known historical event and a known historical time. So you have in the second verse of Mark 13, this is sort of looking at the temple. The disciples are talking to Jesus, and Jesus tells them, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down." Jesus says to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,'" referring to Messiah, "and they will lead many astray. And then later, and this one is the big one, but when you see the desolating sacrilege set up where it ought not to be, and an interesting parenthetical, let the reader understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. So, you may have read this passage before and it may not have flagged for you, but scholars have noted that everything written in that chapter matches up remarkably well with what we know that was going on between 66 and 70 in what's known as the Great Jewish Revolt. This was something that had been building in and around Jerusalem for years and years. You see hints of it in the Gospels text as well. But there was, from taxation to other reasons, a sort of wide-scale revolt that was launched trying to get rid of Roman authority. That began in those uprisings and those false messiahs that are mentioned begin around the year 66. And over the course of those several years, it ultimately culminates in the destruction of the temple. It cannot be overstated what a massive moment this was, not only just within Judaism, but early Christianity as well. The early Christian movement was largely centered in Jerusalem before dispersing to Antioch and other places. And that may be a part of what ends up pushing it into the rest of the Greco-Roman Empire. But you heard that interesting phrase, the desolating sacrilege. What's going on there is this is a quote from the book of Daniel from the Old Testament that specifically refers to governmental control within the temple. This is looking back to 160 BC, a time of Antiochus IV and his sort of hostile takeover of the temple before the Maccabean revolt. A similar thing happens in 70 when essentially Rome conquers Jerusalem, takes over the temple. And that phrase, let the reader understand, scholars have speculated that potentially this was going on as the gospel is being written in the very recent past, potentially even, roughly contemporaneously. This is one of the clues that we have in the gospel that scholars have led to date this finalized version of Mark into somewhere around this time range. Anywhere from 66 to potentially 75, somewhere in that time range. Now, is that a certain thing? It's not. You'll unfortunately find few certainties when it comes to this sort of dating. But for me, it has always felt like one of the most likely scenarios is that you have Mark, this gospel writer, has all of these different, whether they're written or oral traditions that have been passed down over the handful of decades, ultimately leads to, in the wake of this destruction of Jerusalem, collecting all of them, bringing them together into the gospel text, into a final form, and sort of this unified work. We will never have proof of that, but that is part of what has led scholars to believe that Mark, as the first written, likely reached its final form in that time. So I know I'm talking a lot at you. I'm going to pause right here because we're going through a lot of information. Does anyone have any questions really quick before I move on to Matthew? Yes. How did they get to be such good writers? So that's another one of the fascinating things is less so for Mark, but certainly for Luke and John. If these were humble disciples, in some cases humble fishermen, they really did their homework and learned their Greek very well. They are incredibly written. I think about the prologue of John. If that really is John the fisherman, what an incredible writing skill. And that's been one of the complicating factors for scholars over the years is clearly, especially in the case of Luke and especially in the case of John, these were highly educated writers. An impressive degree of weaving all of these sources together, the creativity. I wish I could tell you how it got so good other than divine inspiration. I'll attribute it to that. But they really are remarkable works, especially when you look at others from the ancient world. It's a fascinating thing. So it's a great question. Anyone else?
Centers. Oh, I'm sorry. Did they seek out learning centers like Gamaliel? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Paul studied with him. I mean,
Oh, yeah, Gamaliel the rabbi. Yes,
Right.
yeah,
And I mean, did they just learn of
yeah.
someone knowledgeable? I mean, no, we don't know, but maybe
Yeah.
sought out learned men and shared
And
their
that's always
memoirs.
a possibility as well, is we can never discount just because someone began life as a fisherman doesn't mean they weren't incredibly intelligent and went on to learn at school. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. It's one of those it's one of those things we wish we could go back and truly know. So yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
This is an incredibly stupid question, but
No such thing.
who decided any of these books get included in the New Testament?
Oh, that all right.
Who
So
makes the final decision there?
who makes the final decision? So that is actually, I believe we might have a class on that coming up this fall. It is a complicated history that's a really interesting one. The short answer I would say to that is that there was a sort of informal canon that had been developed over the course of several decades. As we'll see, I actually have a quote from about the middle of the 2nd century stating unequivocally that there can only be 4 gospels. That contrasts with some other gospels that were floating on out there in the world. But the works of Paul become very authoritative early on. You sort of have this informal canon that's floating around among churches. But then in the middle of the 2nd century, and maybe part of why there's this clear stating of the 4 gospels, there was the first church heretic, a man named Marcion, who set up his own version of the canon in which it's believed to have been a heavily edited version of the Gospel of Luke only, and then a handful of Paul's letters that he liked and didn't include the other ones he didn't. And he definitively stated that this was the biblical canon. And the only reason we know about any of this is that there's a wealth of info from other early church fathers writing against Marcion and essentially saying this is not the biblical canon. And that was the first push for the church to start having an authoritative list of books for what had once been relatively informal started to become more codified. The final process, though, in getting it into the form that we have today doesn't actually end up taking place until about the middle of the 4th century, amazingly. Most of the arguments are around a handful of books, short letters, Jude, Revelation. I'm trying to think of a few others that were kind of appear on some lists and not on others. But the final form, I believe, is from about 360. I'm going off of memory, so sorry for that. But that's when you have the New Testament in its final form. But even by the start of the 2nd century, you have these sort of informal lists about what communities feel were authoritative. Sorry, all right. Hope that was a long answer to your question, but hope it was helpful. Yeah, Barbara.
Yes, were any of these gospels written in Aramaic?
We'll get into that with Matthew a little bit. It's an open question, but there is no known evidence to say that they were. However, Matthew's proficiency with the way that some of how he phrases things indicate that he likely spoke Aramaic. He may have been kind of dual language, which wouldn't have been uncommon at that time. There are certainly scholars out there who believe that potentially Matthew started being written in Aramaic before being translated into Greek, but it's unknown. Yeah. Yeah, Steve. Oh, sure.
Is in the early times after Christ was crucified, there's talk of some groups that were more allied with Jewish persons who wanted to keep the dietary laws and all that stuff versus another group that wanted to reach out more to the Gentiles. Is there any of that between any of these 4 writers?
Not to the extent of sharp disagreement, but you're touching on something that was incredibly important in the early church, and actually some of our best hints about it come from Paul's letter to the Galatians and from the book of Acts. I believe it's Acts chapter 15 and then Galatians, the second chapter of Galatians, write about this very important moment, the Council of Jerusalem in about 49 CE. There was essentially a whole gathering of church leaders. There was sort of what would, an air quotes, Gentile faction led by Paul and others. And then another group that are described as sort of Jewish Christians is how I guess we might think of them today, who are arguing over the issue of circumcision and whether circumcision was necessary for those who are becoming Christian. But it's exactly what you're getting at, is do we need to follow kosher law? Do we need to follow other aspects of the Torah? And according to Acts, and you get a little of the blurriness in Galatians, it seems like this problem didn't go away after the Council of Jerusalem, that there was this ongoing debate. Now, the reason I say it's interesting, Mark and Luke, a lot of what you pick up, and we're going to get into this in a couple of weeks as we talk about, we're going to go much deeper on each of these in subsequent weeks. But both Mark and Luke seem to be written primarily to Gentile audiences. Scholars posit that because occasionally Mark will explain Jewish rituals that should just be known things if he's writing to a Jewish audience, but he takes the time to spell out why they're doing it, which wouldn't make any sense unless you were writing to a Gentile audience. And so Matthew, on the other hand, as we'll see next week, is deeply committed to quoting Hebrew scripture. That's one of the foundational things in Matthew's gospel, right from jump almost, of sort of laying out this genealogy of Jesus and tracing it back. Matthew is incredibly interested in this. And so almost certainly Matthew's gospel was being written at minimum to a mostly Jewish community. Maybe there were Gentiles within that community as well. But that might be one of the hints that you have, even if there's not outright conflict between the two. Thank you all. These have been great questions. I appreciate it. Anyone else? Yeah.
Decided at a council, like a big council.
So that was actually what I was getting at with this 360. I'm blanking on the exact name of the council. It was the one right after the Council of Nicaea.
The Council of Trent, is that it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name of it. I'm so sorry. I wish I had the answer for you. But the final definitive list of books that we have in the Bible was decided then. But there was this informal canon that had existed from almost the start of the 2nd century. It was really just a handful of books that appeared on some authoritative lists and didn't on others. But the Gospels, Paul's letters, those appear on virtually every of the early church fathers' lists of authoritative books. So yeah, it's a great question though. And I know there's been all sorts of conspiracy theories spun out about it over the years, and the Dan Browns of the world. So yeah, it's fascinating. All right. Any other questions? I'm loving this. Is fun. Thank you all. Yes. It was, yeah. Oh, okay. Well, so Antioch and Alexandria are two of the really major sites within the early church. So much so that there's actually this is going way deep in the weeds, but there are these sort of schools of text transmission in which you have, again, you can't Xerox gospels back in the day. You had to hand copy them. And so you have sort of this Antiochian school and an Alexandrian school where you trace anytime there's little scribal errors in the text, when they're passed down, they accumulate over time. And so you have this Antiochian text and an Alexandrian text that once upon a time were likely the same thing, but these little, whether it's like a misspelling or things like that, accumulate over time. And so you have these sort of major early centers of text transmission and Christianity. That Alexandrian community grows into the Coptic church that is still active today. But yeah, truly fascinating. It's fun. All right. Oh, okay. Let me check the chat. Oh, that is a welcome friends message. So thank you no, that's fine. No, thanks to everyone online. Appreciate you. And if you do have a question, please, I will try to be better about monitoring. So thank you all. All right, so that is what little we can discern about Mark, or potentially about Mark. So we're going to go ahead and get now into Matthew. You have Matthew and then the angel, touched by the angel, that image that consistently is used for him. So unlike Mark, where there seems to be a lot of confusion around which Mark was it, again, likely because there were so many Marks in first century, Matthew, intriguingly, is pretty consistent within the early records of the church fathers. You have, for once, Papias, Origen, Eusebius, all of the early church fathers do seem to agree about Matthew. Now, interestingly, and we're going to get into this much more next time, the author does seem to have had a Jewish background. You get that in the way, not only just with the genealogy that begins, we'll spend more time with this next week because it's utterly fascinating. Matthew structures this genealogy around groups of 14, which is a Hebrew code spelling out David to represent Jesus's Davidic line. You're not doing that if you're writing to a Gentile audience. You're doing that to people who would know and understand. And so there is sort of this Hebrew lurking in the background. Now, Irenaeus, one of the church fathers, states that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew, which I know was this question. Now, part of, I guess, the curiosity is why the Greek version ends up becoming the dominant one. That might just be the reality of how the early church continued to spread. But clearly, even within the early church, there were speculations that Matthew was originally written in Hebrew. You even get that down to some scholars have seen the way that Matthew structures his gospel is actually structured in 5 parts to mimic the Pentateuch, which is another fascinating thing. But that's neither here nor there. You also have this interesting question: was he a tax collector? Mark and Luke, again, refer to him as Levi, as you saw or the person that is stated in Matthew's gospel as the tax collector. So we're taking, Matthew very well may have been a tax collector, but it's fascinating that we don't see that in either Mark or Luke's text. Very curious. But regardless, Matthew certainly was sort of seen as being connected, as being the disciple himself who was traveling with Jesus. Now, based off of, I believe that potential for Hebrew underpinning the gospel, maybe even other reasons as well. There are some scholars who sometimes propose, and these are the ones who believe that Matthew would have been the first written, that Matthew was written in the 40s or 50s. The vast majority of scholarship, though, believes that Matthew was using Mark as that source, which would mean that it's being placed sometime after when Mark was written, let's say roughly around 70. Now, one of the complicating things and one of the great sort of unknown things is, unlike today, where we can click order and 2-day shipping and we get a book to us very quickly, transmitting text in the ancient world was complicated. It was slow. Everything was handwritten, hand-copied, hand-shared. It's hard to know how much time might have elapsed between Mark being written and Matthew's audience eventually, or Matthew eventually receiving it and being able to work and add on to it. And so you have scholars propose a wide range of dates, anywhere from, sometimes from 70 to 85. Those are guesses. There's not a whole lot of hard and fast evidence that we can place from Matthew's gospel. But scholars have sort of pinpointed that time because by the end of the first century, you see Matthew being quoted by other works. And so clearly by the end of the first century, Matthew has been completed and is being used by others. But when in that window, it's hard to say. Now, one of the other really intriguing things, you've heard me mention Antioch a few times, there are some early church writers, very, very early, both Ignatius and the Didache, which was sort of a collection of early Christian practices, both of which seem to come from the very tail end of the first century, are quoting Matthew and Matthew's version of the Gospels rather than Mark or Luke or John. There seems to be every writer who's based in Antioch is using Matthew's gospel. It's not hard and fast evidence, but that has led scholars to posit that perhaps Matthew was composed in or around Antioch, and potentially that was a point of connection. It will never be known, likely, but it certainly is intriguing. So you have Luke potentially in Rome or Egypt, depends on who you ask. You have Matthew strongly possibly in Antioch. So you have sort of this interesting thing where when we look at a map today, they would look close on a map. In the ancient world, there's a lot of space in between Rome and Antioch. And so these questions of how these communities corresponded with one another is a fascinating one that we really only get hints at. So that's a little bit about Matthew. Let's go on now to Luke, Luke with his ox in tow. So Luke is spoken of, or he's referenced, or there is a Luke referenced in Paul's letters. Pops up in a couple places. In Colossians 4:14, you may have heard sometimes Luke is described as a physician. This is where it's from. In part of Paul's greetings at the end of the letter to the Colossians, Luke is described as a beloved physician. You also see Luke pop up on a list in 2 Timothy and Philemon as well. So seemingly, he was a companion of Paul, or at the very least, very well known to Paul, if he's popping up in multiple letters in multiple places. Some have posited, and this is speculation, that he may have been both part of the Greek Empire, so the Hellenic, but may have been converted to Judaism. But there's not a whole lot of very solid evidence on that. What is intriguing, and one of the fun things about Luke compared to other gospel writers, is that we have a second act, the book of Acts. Scholars, I mean, going back to the early church, have noted Luke and Acts, the writing style is almost identical. It's clearly meant to be a second act to the gospel. And so scholars read this as a unified work. Now, there are intriguing, if you read through the book of Acts, most of it is sort of in an omniscient third-person narration, but there are curious sections that pop up that use the phrase "we" over and over. There's wholesale sections in which it's described as "we" on journeys. Are these firsthand accounts from Luke that are in the biblical text? It's intriguingly possible, and that's one of the fun things that ultimately we may never totally know. Was this just a source that was passed down, or is this the gospel writer's firsthand account? It's a fascinating and fun thing, but you can see these clear lines of connection back to the earliest church, and so that part is fascinating as well. So Luke is almost certainly using Mark as a source. Again, there's that debate between Mark and Matthew, but based off of the high degree of unique material within Luke, as well as the way in which Luke very intentionally seems to mirror the structure of how Matthew structures his gospel, it's highly likely that Luke was using Mark as a source. And so again, these date ranges that are proposed aren't based on anything other than the need for time to go by in order for the text to be transmitted. This is not an assessment of mine. I'm in no position to be judging others' Greek. Mine was not even passable, but scholars who know these sorts of things have noted that Luke's Greek is very, very proficient, really well done. And clearly Luke had some sort of training in terms of his writing. Now, one of the other really fascinating things, and this gets into some of the complications with dating, one of the other known sort of things from that area of the world and that time period is Josephus's, who is a Jewish historian, the Antiquities, that can be reasonably well dated to either 93 or 94. Now, the reason why this is important is that there are some very curious parallels between the Antiquities, things that Josephus mentions in that work, and that Luke mentions. A census by Quirinius, only mentioned in Luke, also pops up in Josephus's Antiquities. There is a list of rebel leaders that gets brought up in the book of Acts. I'm going to look these up. I don't know them off the top of my head. So Judas the Galilean, Theudas, and the Egyptian are all mentioned as being these sort of rebel leaders in Acts. The only other known place where those names pop up is in the Antiquities. Did Luke know about Josephus's Antiquities is a fascinating and puzzling question. And if so, again, the dates don't match up terribly well. Some have speculated that potentially Josephus and Luke were drawing on a similar source, may have even traveled within similar circles. But that is one of the sort of ongoing debates in scholarship, is the level of connection between these two, and certainly is very curious, given again that Luke was writing primarily to a Gentile audience. So why was there so much overlap with a Jewish historian? Truly puzzling and fascinating. But maybe Luke, as stated at the outset of his gospel, is just really good at collecting sources from a wide variety of places and incorporating them. Now, one of the other curious things about thinking about when Luke was written is that if you've ever been reading in the book of Acts, it's very strange that Paul's death, the book of Acts ends with Paul essentially under house arrest, awaiting trial. That's the end of that's the end of the book of Acts. We never get the end of Paul's story. And so why isn't Luke sharing that? It's a fascinating question and something that's puzzled people for many years, given when the Gospels were written. Even if it was written early, it still would have been after Paul's death. So why does Acts avoid that topic entirely? It's one of the great puzzles, and I won't posit until a couple weeks from now what's going on there. So, but that's a little bit about Luke and sort of how that came into being. All right, and now we have arrived at one of easily the most complicated and disputed in terms of the connection. We've spent tons of time now with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it's time to turn now to John. John, we are going to spend a significant amount of time on our last session. It's certainly one of the most beloved Gospels, but also most unique. In fact, I believe I think it's 3/4 of the Gospel of John is not reflected in any of the other Gospels. Totally unique, so it's fascinating. But within the Gospel of John, we hear John specifically state that this is based off testimony by the beloved disciple. Wish that he had named who it was. Some have speculated that this was self-modesty, that he didn't want to identify himself as the beloved disciple, which is certainly possible. Other candidates have been proposed over the years. But the gospel talks about how this was being based off of this disciple's testimony. Now, John is often depicted when you look at images of kind of medieval renderings of the early church. John almost always is depicted as the youngest, long hair, doesn't have a beard. He's very identifiable. It's believed that he actually did live quite late into the first century. Paul specifically names a John as a pillar of the church in his letter to the Galatians, and so there's a good possibility that this may be the same John, ultimately unknown though. But then one of the other intriguing things is you get a lot in history and from early church fathers talking about John the Elder, and for us Presbyterians, that's what's going on there. The elder, not for his age, but that Presbyterian elder. So there's this John the Elder that's being written about. There's also the author of, all right, I'm going to stay a little away from that. In the book of Revelation, this vision given to John, there were speculations for quite some time that Revelation written by John was the same as John the Evangelist. At this point, based off of the writing and a handful of other reasons, most separate this John. Again, John was a very common name within the first century. But this John of Patmos is sort of lifted up as being distinct. Now, intriguingly, there likely isn't a connection between the gospel writer and the book of Revelation, but there is a lot of similarities and resonances with language with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, those letters. Many have speculated that those all came from the same community, potentially even the same writer. And specifically 1st John and the Gospel of John have a great deal of coherence with one another and share a lot of vocabulary. And so it's intriguing to think that maybe these all came from the same early church community. And so we'll spend a lot more time on this, but that's what little we know about John as an author. the gospel itself and the incredibly highly developed Christology that you see, our understanding of who Christ was, most scholars have looked at that as saying that this sort of you don't start seeing really the fruits of this until near the end of the first century. But one of the things that's been baffling over time, and maybe this just gets into John coming from a variety of sources, is that there are also clear signs of accurate descriptions from before the temple was destroyed pop up within the gospel, that if it was being written 2 decades after, how is John so accurately describing landmarks and occasionally using the present tense while doing it? One scholar compared it to, it would be as if today, and we were talking about New York City, that we would be speaking about the Twin Towers in the present tense. That's the level of disconnect going on here, that presumably in John's audience, they would have been aware that Jerusalem, the temple, all of these things were destroyed, and yet John is using it all in the present tense as if they're right here, is accurately describing the architecture, and it's fascinating. And so clearly there is this conflict between what seems to be a really highly developed sense of who Jesus is, likely traditions that have built up over time, but you can also see these hints of a pre-fall of Jerusalem world in the text as well. And so it's really fascinating. One of the other things that also is really interesting is there's some sharp conflicts. You get this a little in Matthew's gospel, but it's extremely pronounced within John's, is a conflict between Judaism and Christianity. Now, interestingly, there is not a lot of evidence from the wider world about actual conflicts and expulsion from synagogues until you get to 80 and even more so towards the end. Early Christians seems to have coexisted quite well with their Jewish neighbors, that there wasn't really an intense conflict between the two until you start getting close to the end of the first century. And so scholars have taken that as sort of a sign of the way that John sort of pits these groups against one another is a sign of that context rather than Jesus's time. So speculation, but one that I think is well warranted. You also have, again, I've cited Eusebius now several times. He states that John was written in Ephesus, which, best known from Paul's letter to the church in Ephesus. And a handful of others within the 2nd century have speculated that as well. So there seems to be a possibility that this Johannine community, so 1 John, Gospel of John, may have arisen out of that context. Again, speculation, but that's the best hint that we have about where it potentially could have come from. All right. And then we'll spend more time on this question in subsequent weeks as well. I didn't even realize we're already over time. All right, well, that's fine. This is fun. There's so much to go. So was John aware of Matthew, Mark, and Luke? It's so hard to say. And this is one of the great things. This is why this book is arguing that there is a relationship between John and that John is actively reimagining Matthew, Mark, and Luke's texts. Others have seen them as being relatively distinct from one another, with there's a little acceptance that the way that Mark structures the passion narrative is fairly similar to how John does. Is their relationship there unknown? But as I said before, over 3/4 of John's gospel is completely unique when you compare it to the other 3. And so it's hard to say that there is a lot of awareness between the two. So this has been an ongoing debate in scholarship. If that is an intriguing question to you, at the end of your packet, the handout, you'll see this Writing and Rewriting the Gospels. If you want a within the last month book about this topic, you are welcome to dive in. For now, though, it will be an interesting question for us to take up in a couple of weeks. Wish we had more time, man. All right, real quickly, I'll run through these. You can time me 3 minutes. So occasionally there have been approaches throughout history. The diatessaron, which is a word meaning out of 4. There's a group that harmonized all of these gospels in about the middle of the 2nd century, which is utterly fascinating. And you have, again, I've mentioned Irenaeus in this quote before, stating unequivocally that there are 4 gospels total and that there can be no more, no less. One of the interesting things from the ancient world, though, and that as people have been discovering over, particularly with the discovery at Nag Hammadi in Egypt, there are more gospels out there, but they are there's a lot of complication here, and this is a class in and of themselves. These Gnostic gospels, by and large, seem to have been written in the 2nd and 3rd century. Occasionally, you'll get resonances with things from the gospels, but by and large, seem to be these incredibly creative accounts of Jesus and his ministry, all centered around this idea of sort of knowledge cult. This is a terrible thing to try to summarize in a few minutes. The Gnostic Gospels is a fascinating topic. It's a really intriguing thing the more you get into it. The one thing that I would lift up, and that does connect to what we'd been talking about before, one of the Gnostic Gospels was discovered, is called the Gospel of Thomas. You may have heard of it before. Is one of the few things that has lent credence to this theory of a sayings gospel. This Gospel of Thomas is only sayings of Jesus, and there's no other narrative around it. It was the first time that any document from the ancient world related to Jesus had been discovered that was sayings only. And so it lent some credence to this theory of Q and potentially a document there. But the Gospel of Thomas gets even more interesting in that there is quite a bit of coherence with parables found in the Synoptic Gospels, but their language is tantalizingly similar, but also very unique from one another. And so you have scholars who speculate that some of this may have been used by early church writers. You have other scholars who speculate that this was written in, say, the middle of the 2nd century. I have never seen a document that gets scholars on both sides of the aisle. Some will argue it comes from the earliest days of the church, others 2 centuries later. And there's been disputes ever since. So that's another whole fascinating subplot in all of this. So just to preview over the next couple of weeks, part of what I was hoping to do today is just give a bit of a broad overview about what we know and don't know and what we can reasonably speculate. Next week, though, we are going to go a lot deeper into using that comparative gospels work, doing this sort of side-by-side as we identify what Mark was trying to accomplish with his gospel, emphasizing who Jesus is and what his ministry meant, and doing the exact same thing with the Gospel of Matthew. And then we'll do the same thing on the final week with the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John. And hopefully at the end of all this, you'll walk away seeing, again, to go back to that image of the pulpit, all these different facets of who Jesus was, taken all together. I think it's such a gift that we have as a church, that we have these 4 incredibly powerful accounts, many of which are showing different aspects of who Jesus is. It's a rarity in the biblical text to have more than one account, and it's an incredible blessing to have 4 well-polished, thoughtful, creative, well-written gospels talking about who Jesus is. And part of the joy is being able to read and discover that together. So I leave you with that, looking forward, and certainly would welcome questions, but I know we're over time, so feel free to come on up, and glad to talk more. Thank you all. Appreciate you.